My name is Tom Harris, and this is Exploratory Journeys. My guest today is Dr. Susan Crockford from Victoria, British Columbia. Dr. Crockford is a zoologist with more than 40 years' experience, including published work on the history of Arctic animals since the end of the last major glacial period 11,700 years ago. Susan earned her undergraduate degree in zoology at the University of BC, and in 2004, a PhD from the University of Victoria in BC. The topic of her PhD dissertation concerned formulating hypotheses about how the evolutionary process of speciation actually works at the biological level in animals like dogs, polar bears, and humans. Polar bear evolution is one of Susan's main professional interests, and until a year and a half ago, she was adjunct professor at the University of Victoria. Susan has published many papers, reports, and books, one of which I'm holding right now, a 2006 book, very interesting book called Rhythms of Life, Thyroid Hormone and the Origin of Species. Most interesting to me and the ICSC are Dr. Crockford's many writings on polar bears and walruses. When this interview is finally put on the web, we will include a list of many of these books, including links to a book that we'll actually be mentioning later in the interview, which is pretty interesting. Dr. Crockford now works full-time for Pacific Identifications, Inc., a private consulting company she co-owns with two colleagues. Her core intellectual interest is evolution. So welcome to the show, Susan.
Hi, Tom. It's a pleasure to talk to you.
Yeah. So can you tell the listening audience, where were you from originally?
I was born in North York in Toronto and moved to Vancouver at the age of 11 after my father died. And then in 1976, I moved to Victoria permanently, and I've been there ever since.
Wow, that's a pretty nice place to be. I kind of envy you this time of year. So when was your first interest in zoology started?
Well, I was always interested in animals as a child, and specifically in polar bears as well. And I got really, that interest was solidified when I was in high school, when in biology class we got to dissect a fetal pig, and sort of understanding how some of those internal systems worked really was fascinating to me, and that really firmed up my decision to go into zoology at university.
Yeah, that's pretty interesting. So how did you get into the study of polar bears in particular? I mean, it's not like we have them in our backyard.
No, indeed. But, you know, as I said, I was interested in the Arctic from the time I was a child. And when I began to work on my project in evolution, one of the things that I was studying was this process of how one animal transforms into another via speciation. And I had chosen as my one example how a wolf turns into a dog. But as a parallel example, I used the transformation from brown bear to polar bear. So that was really in the 1990s. So I've been looking at polar bear literature since then.
Oh, yeah. Now, this is getting a little ahead of ourselves, but you're saying the polar bear evolved from the brown bear. About how long ago would that have happened?
Well, you know, all of the genetic studies that have tried to determine that have come up with various answers that range from 4 to 5 million years ago to about 120 years ago. So my particular opinion on that, given all of the evidence that's available, is that it most likely occurred between about 400,000 and 160,000 years ago.
So, of course, since that time, there's been periods warmer than today and colder than today. So, I mean, the polar bear didn't go extinct or it wouldn't be here. I mean, do you think that they're actually endangered right now?
No, there's no indication that at the present time that polar bears are endangered. What we have to do is look at the present situation. The polar bears exist in high numbers across the Arctic. They're present and abundant in throughout their range, and they're reproducing well. And those are all earmarks of a thriving population. Where the designation of threatened or endangered comes in is those are all based on predictions, model predictions of what might happen in the future, not the situation that's present right now.
Huh. So, in fact, they're basing it on theory, not on observations.
Yes, exactly. And the thing that's really different for polar bears is that they were the first species to be designated based on future predictions, not on present conditions.
It's a bit ridiculous, eh? Well, the activist group, which is called Global Citizen, which ironically is focused on ending world poverty, they have a special webpage entitled "The Plight of the Polar Bear Shows Us the Dangers of Climate Change." And I'll just read you a little quote from them, and maybe you can comment on this. They say, "The impacts of climate change are evident in every corner of our planet, but in recent years, the plight of the polar bear has become especially apparent. For conservationists, February 27th is a chance to highlight the decline of polar bears and call for conservation actions through the International Polar Bear Day." International Polar Bear Day. The sea ice across the Arctic has been decreasing at a rate of 14% per decade, and this rapid loss deprives polar bears of their natural habitat used for building dens and catching seals, their main source of nutrition. Well, what do you think of this? I mean, does this make any sense?
Well, I mean, the reality is that the one part of their statement is true. The sea ice, summer sea ice, anyway, has declined quite remarkably. And in fact, since 1979, summer sea ice has declined about 40%.
Wow, yeah.
Compared to 1979 levels. But the caveat is that based on future predictions, polar bear specialists suggested that polar bears were going to decline by 2/3. That 2/3 of all the bears in the world were going to be gone if ice declines to the levels they are right now. They've been at basically the same summer level with some bit of variation since 2007. And in fact, the U.S. National Snow and Ice Department of NOAA has shown that the sea ice has not declined since 2007. But that level is the level that polar bear specialists said would destroy the polar bear population.
Huh.
And we know now that that's not true, that polar bear numbers have not declined. They may have increased a little bit, but they certainly have not declined to the extent that they were predicted to. So really, that premise is false. I have shown in my book that's called The Polar Bear Catastrophe That Never Happened, that particular scenario has simply not occurred. It's a hypothesis that has been disproven.
Sounds like the climate scare in general.
Yeah. And on International Polar Bear Day, in fact, along with the Global Warming Policy Foundation in the UK, I put together what's called a State of the Polar Bear report. And I've been doing that for the last 3 years now. And so on International Polar Bear Day, I will be releasing a statement, a State of the Polar Bear report for 2020 that people will be able to read and get the facts and all the background on what's going on.
Oh, yeah, so that's coming up on February 27th, International Polar Bear Day. Yeah, so that's interesting.
That's right.
We'll actually circulate your report for sure. Now, one thing that kind of surprises me is that people think that when the ice, actually retreats, that polar bears would have less access to food. But surely it's when the ice advances and they can't break through the ice that they would have less access to food.
Well, certainly we've seen several instances of that in evolutionary sense. there is some evidence that during the last ice age, when the northern hemisphere continents were covered with very thick ice and excluded polar bears from the Arctic entirely, they were pushed out to the edges, that's when their numbers declined, not during the previous warm period when summer ice disappeared entirely. Another piece of evidence of that response to thick ice is what we see in the area off Alaska, the coast of Alaska, where about every 10 years, the ice in the spring gets so thick that the ringed seals and the bearded seals that polar bears depend on for their food, that ice is too thick for them to break through and keep breathing. And so they move to other areas. And the bears come in really needing, that's their essential feeding period, is in the spring. And they feed intensely on newborn pups. And if those pups aren't available, then they starve. And we have evidences documented in the literature. One of the worst periods was from 1974 to 1976. That was 3 years in a row that the bears were suffering from lack of food because of thick ice. But it happened again in 2004 to 2006.
Wow.
To a similar degree, where bears were starving because the ice in spring was too thick to allow the seals they feed on to flourish in the area.
Wow. So it's very much like in many of the circumstances concerning climate change that they have it actually upside down. It's the cold that actually bothers them. I mean, the thickness of the ice because of the cold, not the warming.
Yes. And in this case, one of the things that happens is that they've focused on the decline of summer sea ice because, of course, that's what's been declining the most dramatically. But ice in the winter has declined a little bit, but really not much at all, relatively speaking. And it's because of their focus on summer ice, they have actually ignored what's happened in the spring and in the winter. And that's why their prediction has gone sideways. Primarily, is that they are making an assumption that summer ice is critical when in fact what's happening in spring is actually the critical period.
Yeah. So now, is there some way to observe International Polar Bear Day in a way that actually makes sense?
Well, I would suggest that I've got a number of books on polar bear science. And I think that one of the ways that would be productive for people is to purchase one of those books and donate it to their local library.
Yeah.
Because what I try to do, I've got my recent book, the Polar Bear Catastrophe book, but I've also got a book for children that's called Polar Bear Facts and Myths. And it just lays out what goes on in polar bear and Arctic ecology without scaring children. It's just leaving that fear factor out of it. And that book has been translated into 5 other languages, and even French.
Okay.
My understanding is that people, teachers who are teaching French and French immersion really struggle to find good science books that are in French. And so here is a book that's available in French that's aimed at middle school age children, say 7 and up. And really, a book like that needs to be in schools. It needs to be in libraries.
Yeah.
And that's what people could do, is just to get that non-fear-laden information out to the public.
Yeah, my sister, Jennifer Trewartha, she actually teaches English as a second language to immigrants. So, I mean, that would be an ideal book for them to use to help them understand. And also, as you say, for the French teachers as well. Now, I remember there was a professor at Laurentian University who divided the Arctic into 13 regions, and he showed that for every one of them except 2, polar bear populations were either stable or increasing. And the 2 where he showed a decrease, overhunting was the major cause of with climate change playing some role. But what do you think of that? I mean, in the areas, and I understand there are some, where polar bear populations are dropping, is that an overhunting or what's going on there?
Well, there certainly was one